So now I'm very pleased to welcome Vint Cerf to the stage. He is not an easy man to introduce because there is so much that one could say about him. Please don't, says Vint. And yet, with Bob Kahn, he's the co-inventor of TCP/IP, Internet Protocol. He helped get that up and running in the early days at DARPA, moved to MCI, where he saw the possibilities of commercializing it, even though he had not sought to proprietize it. While working on the little stuff, he's also been thinking big. How will interplanetary TCP/IP work? He's used to these chuckles by now, but when we're on Mars, it's going to be very good to have the video not be so jittery. He's had over 18 honorary degrees. I almost expect the little counter to be here during the talk, and as he gets awarded new degrees, it can increment. He has won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Library of Congress's Living Legend Medal in 2000, and true to its name, he's done a whole lot since then. And it seems he also has an honorary membership in the Yale Political Union, so from the sublime to the ridiculous. Please join me in welcoming Vint Cerf.
Well, good morning, everybody. I don't know what to do with all these wonderful... First of all, I was born in Yale Hospital in 1943, a long time ago, so I have a certain, connection with them. Let's see. Several of the things that came up this morning jogged some memories. First of all, Jonathan, you mentioned 1977. This was an important year for me because that was the first year, November 22, 1977, when we actually got 3 different packet switch nets to talk to each other using the TCP/IP protocols. It started with a mobile packet radio van driving up and down the Bayshore Freeway here in the Bay Area, radiating packets to a gateway that went all the way across the ARPANET through an internal satellite connection all the way to Norway and then down to London, out of the ARPANET, which by then had extended into Europe, through another gateway. We called them gateways then because we didn't know they were supposed to be called routers. So the gateway led this traffic back across a packet satellite network, back down to the east coast of the US through another gateway across the ARPANET, and then all the way to Marina del Rey, California, USC Information Sciences Institute. Now, if you measure the crow fly's distance, it's about 400 miles. If you measure how far the packets went, it's about 100,000 miles, because they were up and down twice on the satellite, back and forth across the US and the Atlantic. So, and it worked. And of course, we were leaping around screaming, saying, it works, as if it couldn't possibly have worked. You all understand that it's software, and it's a miracle when any software ever works. So that's 1977. It's a big deal. The second thing I wanted to observe about cloud computing is that the cloud won't do you any good unless you can connect to it. And so the statistics have to include the reliability of the network connections that get you to and from the cloud. They cannot forget how critical the infrastructure is. So when we talk, for example, about these $30 Android devices, we have to keep in mind that we also have to think about the infrastructure that links those things up to the rest of the net. Now, I'll actually come back to that point in a little bit. The other thing I wanted to observe is that when we bring new technologies into being, sometimes people conclude that they will replace the other ones. They will wipe out the other ones. It's like television wiping out the movies, which it did not do. The existence of some of these technologies does not kill the other ones, but it adds to them and augments. Now, there are some cases, however, where there's a really clear and apparent change underway. Newspaper is in decline. News is not and should not be in decline, although it's a little scary because the business model that supported newspapers is not supporting them anymore, and the advertising model which supports Google and others is not yet supporting the news environment, so somehow we have to sort that out. This is Darwin's observation, which is adapt or die, and that's very, very good advice for every one of us confronted with new technologies. We have to figure out how to adapt to make sure that our business models will be able to operate under new conditions. So now I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. First of all, the mobile has the very interesting property that it's an information window that you hang on your hip or put in your purse. When it's connected to the net and has access to the grid and has access to all the various services on the net, it becomes an information window. And what's interesting about it is that it's available to you the moment that you have a question or have an issue or want to do something, as opposed to waiting until you get to a place where you can open up a laptop. And so it's the immediacy of the mobile, I think, which changes it from being what we had gotten accustomed to in the personal computing world to something which is instantly available to us. It allows us to act on whim. And in fact, anyone who's been in the sales environment knows that whim is often a driver for making decisions and causing transactions to happen. Now, there are some critical things that I would like to ask you to take away from this event about the internet and its technology. It's changing. Going back to 1977, that was the year that we reaffirmed that the internet experiment only needed 32 bits of address space. 4.3 billion addresses seemed like more than enough to do an experiment. I thought that after the experiment was successfully concluded, that we would then develop a production version of the internet. Well, the experiment never ended. And so in February of this year, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers exhausted its supply of IPv4 32-bit address space. There's still some left. It's available in the regional internet registries, but the AP NIC, the Asia Pacific NIC, has run out. And so we are now in a stage where IP version 6, with its 128 bits of addresses, is absolutely essential. The reason I want to emphasize this to you is that it is not a question of whether you have enough IPv4 address space. The question is whether other people have enough. And if they don't, the only place to go is either network address translation boxes, which I can tell you are a crufty bit of complexity, and I apologize if I've insulted anyone who makes these things. They've turned out to be very essential, but they need to be a stepping stone towards getting a larger address space in place. That's why we need to get IPv6 implemented. That's why we need to get it turned on. On June 6th this year, many of us, including Google, participated in turning on IPv6 all around the world. We're going to do it again for a week. The current estimated date is June 6, 2012. Personally, I'm hoping that on January 1, 2013, that we will all turn on IPv6 and leave it on permanently, because that's exactly 30 years to the day when we turned on the internet, January 1, 1983, with its 32-bit address space. So that nice round 30 years just seems like the right thing to do. So please go and ask your teams, are we ready for IPv6? Ask your suppliers of internet service, do you have and provide IPv6 service? And if you don't, what's the plan and what's the schedule? It's absolutely vital. Second, if none of you walked into the room thinking about security, please, when you walk out of the room, think about security. The internet is a wide open environment. It was designed to be as open as possible. You could say, why didn't you put more security in at the time when you started? The honest answer is the technology that was needed to do it at the time was classified. I know, because I developed a classified secured internet with the National Security Agency starting in 1975. But I couldn't tell any of my colleagues about the way it was worked and the technology we used because it was classified. But this is 2011. Technology is available to do a better job. It can be retrofitted into the net. Don't let anybody tell you that you have to start over completely. There are things that we can do. For example, domain name system security, DNSSEC with digitally signed signatures in the domain name system will allow for validation of the integrity of the lookup when you get an IP address back. There are a whole series of other kinds of things, including digital signatures on email, encryption if necessary, or at least digital signatures on other files and things whose integrity is important to you, digital signatures and or encryption on transactions and things of that sort. We are, as a community on the net, in a fairly hostile environment. There are a lot of people who are interested in not doing nice things, but doing bad things on the net, including finding out what you're doing, even if you don't want them to. So we have serious work to do as a community to implement new technologies and also to adopt practices and standards that will improve the security of the net. Some people still use the word password as a password because it's easy to remember. The problem is everybody else remembers that too. So what we need is things like two-factor authentication. Oh, I realized I was supposed to take this off so you wouldn't know who I was. There we go. So we use two-factor authentication at Google, which means that we generate 6-digit random passwords every 30 seconds or so. You can't log into the systems without having that available. Things like that get past the problem of wanting to change passwords dynamically. It's all done automatically. There's lots more to be said, and I don't have a lot of time left to do it. I wanted to come back now to an observation about mobiles and more generally an Internet of Things. We're starting to see an awful lot of devices showing up on the Internet that never would have been there at least 30 years ago. Things like refrigerators and picture frames and ordinary appliances like the projection systems that are putting these things up on the walls, or printers and things of that sort. I used to tell jokes about Internet-enabled light bulbs. I can't tell a joke about it anymore. There is an Internet-enabled light bulb. It has an IPv6 radio in it, and you can remotely turn the light bulb off and on or tell what state it's in. Now, I know your reaction is only a geek would want to do that. However, I also have an Internet version 6, IP version 6, radio-based sensor network running in the house. It's a commercial system. It was made by Archrock, which was acquired by Cisco Systems not too many months ago. It runs 24 hours a day, and every 5 minutes it's sampling temperature, humidity, and light levels in every room in the house and recording that in a server down in the basement. I know, you're back to only a geek would do that. The reason that I'm doing it is very practical. I want to have real data about how well the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system is doing after 12 months. So when it comes time to examine whether or not we have the baffle set correctly and the speed of the fan and so on, we actually have real data as opposed to anecdotal information. You are, many of you, CIOs of your businesses. Real data counts. Anecdotal stuff is interesting. Data is what drives the business. It's important for you to be able to have that data, make it available, analyze it, and visualize it. You remember Dick Hamming? He was a guy who was very big in numerical analysis. He said the purpose of measurement is not numbers. The purpose of measurement is insight, and that is exactly what you want. And you'll be hearing from many people today about the various kinds of applications that Google has available to help you derive insight from the kinds of numbers that you collect. Finally, I want to underscore two other things. One of them is what happens when you connect things to the Internet. Think for just a minute about mobiles. By themselves, without access to the Internet, a lot of the applications that they run wouldn't be very interesting or might not work at all. So what's interesting and powerful about the mobile environment, from my point of view, is that the mobile has become connected to services accessible on the Internet. This augments both platforms, because the platform on the net is more useful if it's immediately accessible to you when you want it. The device, the mobile that you're carrying, the smartphone that you're carrying, is enhanced and more useful if it can do things with things on the net when you want. And so when you think a little bit about what happened, as data became transportable from the mobiles through the mobile wireless networks and passed into the Internet to get access to the online applications, it ignited an enormous new thinking about applications, and that's why apps, you so often hear there's an app for that. And in fact, that's often true. What's important about this whole app evolution is that third parties have had an opportunity to design and build those apps. And that, I think, is one of the interesting secrets about the openness of the Internet. Setting security aside for a moment, which I do not discount, the open ability to develop new protocols, new applications, and try them out without getting permission from every Internet service provider in the world has been vital to the Internet's growth and to the space in which you currently operate. So connecting things to the Internet has an interesting way of enhancing both sides of the equation. There will be more ways of getting things connected to the net. There will be more things that are connected to the net, and they too will generate more applications and more ideas. The last thing that I wanted to bring up before we get into some Q&A is Internet governance. Those of you who follow this space know that the internet is a disruptive influence in almost every dimension you can think of: economic, social, technical, business, and frankly, political. And no one can, I hope no one will ever forget the effects of the Arab Spring, much of which is attributed to people organizing themselves through social networking platforms. The reason I bring this up is that there are governments now who see the internet as a very important economic element and an important social element and an important political element in their worlds. Historically, governments have felt in control of things like that. They feel less in control of the internet because of its ubiquity and because of the fact that it is borderless. The packets don't really know that they've crossed an international border. All they know is they move from one place to another in the net. This generates a lot of tension. And so there are governments, especially those who are, let us say, feel fragile in the presence of information going to their populations about what's really going on, who are quite concerned about that. And this is emerging in the form of countries wanting to get more control over the internet. Now, I must tell you, and again, I may insult somebody in the room here, but even our own government is beginning to go a tad overboard on intellectual property protection. Domain seizures by the Department of Homeland Security are, in my view, a blunt instrument that could be and should be exercised much more carefully. So there are some big issues coming. The International Telecommunications Union would like to be responsible for more of Internet's operation and policy. Multi-stakeholder organizations like the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, the Internet Governance Forum, have been trying to hang on to and emphasize the importance of all voices, yours included, being part of the equation in establishing governance policy for the internet. Remember, governance is a very, very big word. It includes law enforcement, it includes human rights, it includes freedom of speech, it includes the ability to conduct economic transactions, business transactions on a worldwide basis. It touches everything. It touches the World Trade Organization. It touches the intellectual property world, WIPO and others. It touches the standards world, the Internet Engineering Task Force, the ITU, ISO, and others. It's everywhere, and that is why internet governance is topic A in many quarters. Well, I'm going to stop there. That's enough of a fire hose. If there are questions, I'm prepared to try to answer them. There are microphones here. Let me warn you that I'm hearing impaired. That doesn't mean that I won't listen to you, but it might mean I may have trouble understanding what you said. That doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means I didn't hear very well. So, Jonathan, if I don't seem to be doing very well with the questions, we can pretend that it's because I didn't understand them as opposed to I'm stupid. So let me ask for the first one. Would you mind saying who you are, by the way?
Sure. My name is Dave Edstrom. I'm president, chairman of the MT Connect Institute, and basically it's an institute that is an open royalty-free protocol that's connecting the 3 million machine tools. The question I have for you is, a few years ago when I was at Sun Microsystems, we had a Yale professor come in and said that what we should do is we should publish everyone's social security numbers out on the web or in a newspaper, because using your birth date and your social security number as the way to authenticate who you are is not secure and doesn't really work. And I guess the question that I have for you, Dr. Cerf, is what is Google doing and what are you doing so that when someone that we can accurately identify who someone is today?
Okay, well, let me distinguish between identity. It's okay, and you can stand there for the answer or you can sit down. It's up to you. Okay. It won't be a half-hour lecture, at least I hope not. First of all, let us distinguish identity from identifier for one moment. Your email address is not your identity. Your email address is an identifier. There are ways of strongly authenticating identifiers. We could associate identifiers with identity. We don't have to, but we could, and there are many cases where we should and must. So let me just start there. In the case of an identifier, it's an arbitrary string. We would like it to be bound to something like our account. So when you log into Gmail, assuming you're using it, You have a username and a password. If you wish, we will also supply you with a little thing, which I'm not wearing right now. It's a little two-factor authentication USB gadget that generates those 6-digit random numbers I mentioned earlier. This is our way of trying to make more strong the authentication of an identifier. Again, this is not an identity, just an identifier. However, you and I could imagine having transactions. We could be exchanging email, not quite knowing who we are. And at some point, I might say to you, could I borrow $50,000? And your reaction to this would be, well, I need to know a little bit more about who you are as opposed to who your identifier is. And so I might even supply you with a substantial amount of information, claiming I have a job and I have resources and so on. And your response to this is, even if it's digitally signed, let's say, your response is, well, I'm not sure that I believe all that. I need to go to a trusted third party to validate what you said. Now, in the course of this kind of interaction, at some point, the identifier and me, the party wanting to transact with you, has to become sufficiently well known as an identity for you to be satisfied that this transaction makes sense. There are perfectly good technologies that are usable today that can help us achieve that objective. That is, to make identifiers strongly authenticated and to associate identity when we wish. I want to emphasize to you, it should not be required that anyone reveal their identity simply in order to use the net. I think that we should preserve our ability to be pseudonymous or anonymous. But there are times when we absolutely have to strongly authenticate ourselves, and we want that because we don't want other people to pretend to be us. We want those strong authentication tools available to us for our purposes. So people hear about certificates and certificate authorities and things like that. Frankly, that's not working out too well because some of the certificate authorities have become compromised. Some of you will know about the fellow in Pakistan who boasted of generating a whole bunch of false certificates. So there's work going on in the Internet Engineering Task Force to actually take the DNSSEC system, which is a hierarchy of digitally signed domain names, and insert into certain domains the certificates that are bound in scope only to that part of the domain name system, to that zone. This is the work group at IETF is called DANE, D-A-N-E. The idea here is that in the certificate authority world, you can authenticate a long arbitrary URL or a long arbitrary domain name. In the DANE system, you can only authenticate something that's part of the signed hierarchy down to that part of the zone file. I'm sorry if I've gone all geek on you, but what I'm trying to convey is that there are mechanisms available to us now that would allow us to do a much better job of protection. As to publishing everybody's social security number and so on, I don't agree with that. I think that that's still not a useful thing to do. It's still supposed to be a protected identifier, but I don't think we should rely on that as identifiers. I think we need to introduce these other methods to allow us to strongly authenticate.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, sir.
Hi, Vint. John Furry, the founder of SiliconANGLE.
Hi, John.
Covering cloud, mobile, and social for a couple of years now. And you mentioned security and internet governance. Can you talk about the state of encryption, especially international? There's been some backlash with BlackBerry over the years in terms of originating traffic. So it's kind of a governance issue as well as...
Yes, it is.
Can you share with us your vision and what's happening?
So first of all, some of you will know that the older algorithms like RSA and the like and DES have been superseded now with AES, and there's another one coming after that. The elliptic algorithms, which have been patented by a company in Canada, also shows great power and efficiency. So I am comfortable that we have some pretty good technology for basic cryptography and also for efficiency. So we have to go from public key style things to symmetric keys in order to achieve speed. That's still true. But there are very good algorithms, and the larger the key, the harder the work factor. And that's really what this is all about. It's producing enough of a work factor that it will be economically uninteresting to try to break something cryptographically. The thing that worries me more than anything is not the cryptography. What worries me are all the other avenues through which people can get information without having to go break code. So, for example, spear phishing, which played very significantly in a recent report that we offered about people going after Gmail accounts, is a case in point. People received email that contained a spreadsheet which had a Flash program embedded in the spreadsheet. And when you opened the spreadsheet, the Flash program ran, and it, in fact, installed a keylogger or a related piece of malware. People clicked on those messages because they looked credible. There's also the general problem of browsers not being careful and paranoid enough to keep malware from being downloaded just because you looked at a web page. I'm much, much more worried about these open avenues for attack, not so much the cryptographic and cryptanalytic challenge, but rather the social challenge, the social engineering challenge, the tricking of us. We're going to have to teach ourselves and our kids to think much more carefully about what they do on the net, to be much more aware of the risk factors of not doing certain things that pose high risk. So that's really where I think we have to go. Jonathan.
You know, they have the Burning Man festival not too far away from here, and every year, as I understand it, people lament that Burning Man just isn't what it used to be. Everybody wants to be the last person invited and then not have any of
and not have anybody else, I see,
exactly.
Okay.
And
Did they burn you in effigy there?
There's a theme today, isn't there? And it causes me to ask by analogy, given the number of years from the very start you've seen the development of internet protocol and networking technologies, is there a huge advantage to developing them in a backwater where there isn't the bright scrutiny of a bunch of companies, governments, everybody thinking, wow, this is tomorrow's network, we have to get it right and make sure we don't get hurt by it? We see how hard it is to even get IPv6 up and running. Are the heady days of being able to get a bunch of people in a room at the IETF and sort of invent a new protocol, are they sort of behind us now? Can you talk a little bit about the environment of trying to get something done?
Okay, so the short answer is no, that we are not trapped. But for any system in which there is already heavy investment, for systems in which you already have a lot of existing software and hardware and everything else, change is difficult. It's in the places where there isn't very much pre-existing investment that change is easiest. And that's why we see applications becoming so popular, because the architecture invites opportunity to create new applications without having to change everything underneath. This is the enabling aspect of the layered internet. The part that's hardest is when you want to change a layer that's down lower, and especially the IP layer, which is sort of the critical layer. It's where all the routing takes place. It's where all the domain name lookups take place. It's that layer that we're trying to change, either with regard to IP version 6 or with regard to certain kinds of security like end-to-end IPsec. So that's harder. It's much harder. And there are times when you wish that you could just stop the world and start all over again. We can never quite do that. And it's entirely possible that something new will have to come along that isn't internet, but is better, before some of these problems get solved. Before you say, well, how could that possibly be? The internet's now got 2.5 to 3 billion users, and who knows how many of those are overlapping with the mobiles. Huge investment, lots of infrastructure. How could we possibly start over? But we might have said the same thing in 1973, when Bob and I started writing the specs for the internet, because the system then in place was called the telephone system. There was one major carrier in the US, it was called AT&T. Most of the other telephone systems were operated as national enterprises, so to speak. And of course, here we are, almost 40 years later. Of course, the world looks different. It's entirely conceivable that something can come along and replace the internet and be more ubiquitous, be less expensive, and be better. I don't know what that is, to be honest with you, because when Bob and I did the original design, one of the things very high in our mind was that we wanted it to be future-proof in the sense that any new communications technology that came along could be swept in and carry internet packets on it. And that's been true now ever since the beginning of this network. Every time a new technology comes along, whether it's ATM or frame relay or MPLS or something else, we've been able to carry internet packets on it. But skunkworks, which is what you were describing, are wonderful, wonderful places where you are sheltered from scrutiny and protected while you try things out. So I'm a huge believer in skunkworks. And if you have an opportunity as a policymaker in your company to create or protect a skunkworks, please think carefully about doing that, because that's where a lot of creativity comes from. You're relieved of the burden of justifying something too much until you figure out whether it works. And we have that freedom in the internet today.
Which, in the minute we have left then, I can't help but ask, if somewhere out in the world there is that young kid, the Archimedes, who says, "Eureka, I've just discovered the thing that's going to replace the internet." And of course, the first thing she does is place a call to you for advice. And she says, "So I'm just trying to figure out, should I publish the spec tomorrow, or should I head to the patent lawyer? What should I do?"
I may again offend somebody in the audience. Shoot the patent lawyer. Bob and I knew when we did this work that we would not succeed, even if we could succeed. We could not have succeeded if we tried to protect the internet's design. We published freely, openly, deliberately, hoping that this would remove any barrier and any excuse for not adopting it in the proprietary world. And as it turns out, that worked out very well. I think that's still pretty good advice.
Very good. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Jonathan.
Pleasure.